Thank you for joining our In the Know podcast series. My name is Nirmala Perera and I'm your host today. I am the social media coordinator for the IOC World Conference on Prevention of Injury and Illness in Sport. Also, I am a member of the Sport Without Injury program at Linköping University in Sweden. Currently, I work as the Clinical Research Project Officer at the AIS. Today, our guest is the IOC Medical and Scientific Director, Dr. Richard Budgett. Welcome to the podcast, Richard.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Budgett has a list of accomplishments that even the hardest to please would be impressed by. So, let's start with sporting career. You are an Olympic gold medalist from the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984. Can you give us a snapshot of your sporting career?
Yes, I suppose it was a relatively short sporting career, certainly at a highest level. I went to the World Championships, rowing World Championships in 1981, and won a surprise bronze medal, and then continued with the what was then a sort of national squad until we came to the Olympic year, and then we trialled for a four, and I got in the top boat, which was the four. With Martin Cross, Andy Holmes, and Stephen Redgrave, and then we went to the Olympics actually as favourites, having beaten the East Germans and the Russians in Europe, and of course they then boycotted the games. But we went to the games in Los Angeles, and we in the end came from behind against the American crew, and won gold. And of course, little did we know at the time that Steve Redgrave would go on and win four more Olympic gold medals in the next four Olympic Games, spanning 16 years. Quite remarkable.
Yeah, that is quite fantastic. And you are part of that very special group of Olympic gold medalists too. So congratulations. Um, so as I mentioned before, you are the IOC Medical and Scientific Director. What led you to your career?
Well, I went straight into my junior doctor training after the Olympics, which was a bit of a shock, having not seen a patient for more or less a year. But then I went into general practice, and then as I finished the general practice training, did a year of sport and exercise medicine, got a diploma in sport and exercise medicine, and then went to work with the British Olympic Medical Centre, so the British Olympic Association, RNOC in the UK. And then it just progressed from there, and I became team doctor for the British bobsleigh team. I obviously looked after the rowing team as well at times, and many other sports, and eventually became the chief medical officer for Team GB. Did that for 16 years, going to a number of Olympic Games as a doctor. And I think as a doctor in Olympic Games, you do learn a lot. You know, it's great being an athlete, but you're totally focused on your performance. And then when you go there in the medical support team, it really gives you an insight into the stresses that all the athletes are under, because you see the ones that are struggling and the ones that are triumphing. And you realize that most athletes who go to Olympic Games end up disappointed. It's everyone has high expectations. It's a really tough one. But anyway, it was a fantastic experience. And then, of course, we won the bid for London 2012. So I became chief medical officer for the London organising committee, and then went through to 2012, and then applied to the IOC for the medical director role, got that, and I've been here for nearly 8 years.
Wow, that's pretty amazing career. Do you have any tips for those up and coming sport physicians?
You know, we all know how tough it is in sport and exercise medicine. In many countries, there's no distinct career path. It's not something you go into because it's safe and easy. It's something you have to go into because you feel passionate about it. And I don't think you have to have been an athlete or an elite athlete. You just have to really love sport. As it was with me, it starts off with volunteering. So you put yourself out there, and I did research in sport, and sports are crying out still for so much. There's so much to be done research-wise in the prevention of injury and illness in sports. So the surveillance, the other research you can do, and so I did research, became involved. Went volunteer to go with teams, and eventually it builds up to something that's actually a career. But now, certainly in the UK and many other countries, sport and exercise medicine is recognised as a speciality. So there is a career path, but I'm not saying it's an easy career path. So you have to really want to do it.
That's great advice, and also segue to look at some of the work that you do as part of the IOC's medical and scientific department. There are 26 published IOC consensus statements based on the work of the Medical and Scientific Commission. Can you give us a quick overview?
Yes, I think the consensus statements are a fantastic initiative by the IOC Medical and Scientific Department and Commission. They started back in the early 2000s, and I have to pay tribute to Dr. Patrick Shamash and Professor Lars Engebretsen, who is our head of scientific activities. And it started back in 2003 with sport nutrition, Professor Ron Morn, who many of you will know, there have been many consensus statements since then, really aimed at areas where there is an issue in sport medicine. So it's something that's important to athletes that may not be tackled properly in athletes, that all of us who are part of the multidisciplinary team may need guidance and advice. Where there is a call for more research, where there's new research that's not being put into practice. So there's a number of criteria to decide whether a particular subject is suitable for an IOC consensus. Can the IOC make a difference? Is it worthwhile us doing? Because lots of people do consensus statements, but will it help if the IOC do a consensus statement? And obviously we're in quite a privileged position in that we can pull together the best people in the world, most often to actually lead and produce the consensus statement. And back in 2003, as well as nutrition, there was sex reassignment in sport, which has gone through a number of iterations and is still a major challenge for us in the Olympic movement. Sudden cardiovascular death in sport in 2004. Then there was sexual harassment and abuse in 2006, and now the prevention of harassment and abuse in sport is one of the central pillars of our activities, hugely important, and the safeguarding that happens at the Olympic Games, and the safeguarding we really push to be put in place in all NOCs, IFs, and other sports bodies. So I suppose that leads me on to thinking, well, it's all very well producing a wonderful consensus statement published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine nearly always, but we have to make sure that it actually changes into action, and that it actually is followed up effectively. Now, in the past, we may not have done that as effectively as we could, but I would say now things are changing. And the most recent consensus statements, for instance, on mental health in athletes and on surveillance in athletes, and coming up soon, respiratory illness in athletes, they are really being followed up effectively. Other notable consensus statements have been the Red S, which is used to be the female athlete triad, and pregnancy in elite athletes, the periodic health evaluation, which has been used extensively over the years, and of course concussion in sport, which started in 2008, and every 4 years there's a review and the scats that are produced with our partners in the international federations. So the follow-up of consensus statements is, I think, the most important initiative we can make, following up from the bedrock, the foundation of the consensus itself.
A huge part of the work that's been done is to protect athletes' health and well-being.
And the chairs of each of our consensus statements do a huge amount of work to make sure they're as successful as they are. And I'd also like to say we benefit from a network of research centres around the world. And there's 11 research centres, including in Australia and, well, in all 5 continents. They actually form a foundation of research into prevention of injury and illness in sport. We meet once a year for the exchange of all the research and ideas that have happened and are planned, and then these centres are stimulated and helped to do relevant research to protect athletes.
Speaking of research, the IOC World Conference, again, great way to showcase and disseminate that knowledge. Can you share some of your thoughts on ripple effects on sports and exercise medicine because of COVID-19, and how sports and exercise medicine been affected by it?
Yes, that's a good question, because The obvious effects are things like the delay of the postponement of the Olympics, the postponement of our World Conference. That was a huge disappointment. It's the jewel in our crown, the World Conference on Injury and Illness Prevention. Once every 3 years, it is probably the most important conference we do in the IOC Medical and Scientific Department. But at least it is going ahead in February next year in Monaco. So that is a relief. I think the biggest issue is uncertainty, because we don't know how this pandemic is going to play out. So in the sports movement, we don't know exactly how and when all the events will start to take place again, in what form they'll be able to take place, and what our roles will be. I know many of my colleagues have had frontline clinical roles, and that's been hugely challenging. And the other aspect I think we've all reflected on, and I've seen this amongst the associations in sport and exercise medicine, is the importance of health and physical activity, because we all know how metabolic syndrome, obesity is a high risk factor for anyone who suffers from COVID-19. So it just reinforces the importance of the sport and exercise medicine playing its part in trying to reduce metabolic syndrome. And then we come onto the elite end and athlete health, and all the concerns there are around this really quite nasty virus. And the worry about the pneumonia, but obviously myocarditis and the post-viral fatigue, and the care that needs to be taken with the rehabilitation of those athletes. So I think we've always, as a sport medicine fraternity, been very careful about rehabilitation of athletes, always trying to hold them back. They want to get back in there, don't they, as quickly as they can, but we're trying to give that stepwise return to sport. Now, 90+% of the time athletes get away with it, but sometimes they don't. And I think the risks are higher with coronavirus. And I just said I think there because we don't know. And that's one of the big challenges we've got, I think, as a sport medicine fraternity, is how to get the evidence, how to have a base in fact on our opinions, our extrapolations on the best way to rehabilitate athletes if we think they've had coronavirus, or they've been severely ill with COVID-19.
So has it shaped the activities of the Medical and Scientific Commission?
We're still very concerned about concussion and prevention of injury, but COVID-19 has really sort of taken over our consciousness and our day-to-day activity. We had a fantastic relationship anyway with the World Health Organization, working very closely with both the group that are looking after the Global Action Plan for Physical Activity, GAPA, under Dr. Fiona Bull, and also the mass gathering group with Maurizio Barbesci. This has been a cooperation through all the times of norovirus that we've had at previous games, even Ebola when we were in the Youth Olympic Games in Nanjing, and now, of course, with coronavirus. So the WHO have been hugely important partners. The activities of the Medical and Scientific Commission are really focused on trying to understand the direction that this pandemic is going, because that makes a huge difference to all of us in sport. And it's been a fascinating journey talking to experts all over the world, whether they be from institutions, from the World Health Organization, from governments, or from hospitals and research centers, because everyone has slightly different views on the way this pandemic will go. There is a strong school of thought that actually, similar to previous coronaviruses and other viral outbreaks, the severity will reduce over time. It will become seasonal, and we'll learn to live with it, whether or not we develop a vaccine. Others feel that there is really no guarantee of that happening, and we have to contain the virus as has been done around the world, and work as hard as everyone is working for a vaccine. And then there's the views on how long would it actually take for an effective vaccine to be produced, anything between sort of 8 and 18 months from now. and the challenges there are there, not only to have an effective vaccine, but to produce it at scale, to distribute it to all the people who need it, and to get it as a priority to healthcare workers and then everybody else. So it's been very interesting talking to those who are at the front line on that production of the vaccine, and really realizing the unique challenges there are. But never before has so much resource, so much huge intelligence been put to a problem like this. And there are some really novel ways of producing vaccines, which I'm sure you've all read about, that really may come into their own thanks to the stimulus of this coronavirus. And so there could be a good legacy in that there will be better, quicker ways of producing vaccine after this crisis. And there are silver linings. You know, our Medical and Scientific Commission has never spent so much time effectively communicating through social media, through calls on Skype or Zoom or any of the other tools. And we're suddenly realizing that we don't have to fly all around the world to meet up. We can actually effectively work remotely. And so it's been eye-opening for us, as it has, I think, for everyone involved, not just in sport and exercise medicine, but all activities around the world.
As you mentioned before, WHO is an important partner for the IOC, and as part of its effort to proactively limit the risk of spreading the coronavirus, the IOC, led by Sports Director Kit McConnell, Professor Erdner from the Medical and Scientific Commission, and the rest of the team from Medical and Scientific Commission, including yourself, other sporting organizations contributed to drafting a document to provide specific public health guidelines for those who organize in sports events. Can you give us a quick overview of it?
Okay, yeah, this was really important, and I have to pay tribute to the World Health Organization for producing this guidance really very quickly. And it was around key planning considerations for bodies organizing events, very close to the heart of the IOC and to all the international federations and others in sport. And also worth mentioning that we had a formal signing of a new memorandum of understanding between the IOC and the World Health Organization on the 16th of May. And our president and the Director General of the World Health Organization signed this together, and then they had a press conference on a couple of bicycles in the World Health Organization headquarters, set 2 meters apart. But I think that was good because it was symbolic, but it leads on from there that the cooperation has been ongoing and I think will be strengthened in the future thanks to what we've been through together. But this guidance document, which we've all worked on together, and now has been taken up by many other bodies and made sport specific, made event specific, made situation specific, focuses on, you know, is it a lower or higher risk sport? What is the size of the event? Is it international or national or very local? Is it indoor or outdoor? What is it just one venue or many venues? And looking at the demographics, is it an at-risk population who are going to be attending this event? And then what is in place to communicate the risks and communicate the mitigation that's going to be put in place. And so the WHO now have a comprehensive document where you assess the risk factors and then you put in the mitigation and you get a score which gives you a very low risk, medium risk, or a high risk. And when you look at the prime risks at the beginning, it's community spread, which is the big one. So if we think about a pandemic like the one we've been going through, you can think there's 5 phases. And the first phase is when it's building up, and that lasts until the number of recoveries are equal to the number of new cases. And then you go into the second phase, where the restrictions are in place, but they begin to be reduced, which may be a month or so. And then you get into the third phase where the restrictions are limited further and the number of cases are dropping. And many of us in Europe are in that phase at the moment. And then you get into the fourth phase where the pandemic or outbreak is effectively controlled, but the sporadic cases, sporadic clusters of cases. And when you get to that fourth phase, then that's the situation in which you can consider these mass gathering events, these sport events, and bringing people together, if the public authorities have the capacity to identify, trace, contact, and isolate, and so clamp down immediately on any outbreak. And then, of course, the fifth phase is where we're back to normal life with no restrictions. And everyone debates as to how long it's going to take to go through those phases, leaving aside our previous conversation about vaccines and the possibilities of treatment like remdesivir, which can make a difference if we have an effective treatment for people who get severely ill. And I think the situation is improving as everyone becomes more knowledgeable about this virus, becomes better at putting in place the restrictions, the so-called lockdown, and the capacity for testing and tracing becomes bigger and better. It means that there's a less risk associated with bringing everybody together. But clearly, if there is still community spread, you can't hold a massive event. If there's community spread in the countries where athletes are coming from, that's a potential risk and needs to be taken into account. The risk groups I've mentioned, and then you may have heard of something called the 3 Cs, which is being close, being confined, and conversation. So if you're close to someone, we know about that. We know about physical distancing. If you're in a confined space, the risk is higher. And if you're in conversation, particularly if you're shouting or singing, then that's a risk as well. And if those situations can be reduced, that will reduce the risk as well. And so once you've got those risks, then you look at the mitigation. And this is all in the document, in the guidance document that WHO have produced. The understanding and overview by the organizers, the connection with the public health authorities, the capacity of those authorities, and then, of course, the things we all know about hygiene, the measures are going to be put in place, the PPE that will be in place, how it will be used, the screening, will there be testing, will you do temperature checks, is the self-screening, etc. And then really importantly, the communication of all that to the people who are going to be there, and the continued working with public health. And I suppose really importantly as well, we need to improve how this is working all the time. There's another iteration coming out very shortly. It's a living document. So anyone who holds an event needs to feed back to the World Health Organization how it went, how using the tool was helpful, what the issues were, so that the framework and this tool can be further improved so we can hold events more and more safely in the coming months.
Yeah, so it is like a evidence-based process to update the document, but applicable for different settings.
Exactly. Well put. Yeah, and I know the WHO, our colleagues at the WHO, with particularly led by Maurizio Barbesci, are really keen to get feedback from all those who are using the tool, because it needs and they want to make continual improvements.
And with the pandemic, we are also experiencing an infodemic. I am aware that the IOC Medical and Scientific Department is currently creating a dedicated section on the IOC website to collate scientific papers and articles on COVID-19 related to sport as a credible source of information for clinicians and scientific community. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. There is a real issue with this infodemic and the amount of information and trying to decide whether it's reliable or not. I'll start off by just saying there's an all-partner task force focused on Tokyo. Our priority in the IOC is Tokyo 2020 in 2021. And this all-partner task force is a way of making sure that we're in seamless communication with the WHO, the IOC experts, and we have some great experts in the IOC, the organizing committee of the Games, and they have public health experts as well, and then the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, and then the Tokyo Health Authority, the Japanese health authorities as well. So all those are in this all-partner task force. making sure that the measures we put in place, the risk assessment we put in place for the games, really very similar to what is being done for all the events that are coming up, will be done as effectively as possible, and we hold the games as near as possible to normal, but making sure the priority is the health of everyone involved. So really to tackle it, or to help tackle this infodemic, we're putting together a web page which is starting with Athlete 365, which is done by our sport department for athletes and their support staff. And if you go onto Athlete 365, there's a huge amount there already on supporting athletes through the coronavirus crisis, and a lot of it focused around the mental challenges, the challenges to the big changes in their lifestyle, to training, to the limitations, to the uncertainty they're under. I suppose having a fixed date for the games next year was some degree of certainty for those athletes, but still it's a hugely uncertain and difficult time. But on the Medical and Scientific Commission webpage, we're building, thanks to experts such as Martin Schwellnus, a website that looks at the epidemiology of COVID-19 in athletic groups, the pathophysiology in athletes if they're infected, the clinical presentations that we see in athletes, the management of athletes and heavily exercising individuals, and then really importantly, the return to sport. In all athletes avoiding the risk of return to sport, because they've all been effectively, many of them cross-training rather than training in their sport, so they've got to become conditioned first, the pre-training and preparation, and then if they have been unlucky enough to be infected, how they come back to sport post-infection, depending on what the sport is, the monitoring, the testing that needs to be done, and again, most importantly, their mental health and the psychology around this and the stresses around that. And we're hugely fortunate because fortuitously, we had planned a respiratory consensus in June this month. And so we've had a group of about 30 experts from around the world who've been working together for the last year to produce this respiratory consensus. Now, this group, plus representatives from our research centers, plus other specialists, so well over 40 people, are focusing all their efforts on the COVID-19. So it's an extra subgroup, effectively, to this respiratory consensus to deal with the infodemic, to try and make sure that we get reliable, useful data available for the teams, for the multidisciplinary teams who are looking after athletes, and also importantly to stimulate the production of case series, so that we have some experience through a multidisciplinary international case series around how athletes recover. Is it really as bad as people say? Because we see the worrying case reports, but I suspect there's a huge number of athletes who are recovering without any issues. So we can get a proportionate response and appropriate protocols for athletes to recover and come back to full training.
I think we will leave it there. And I really like to thank you for your time, Richard. And also, I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today. So thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much indeed, Nim.